He was just another quiet figure on the sidewalk until she whispered a childhood nickname Keanu Reeves hadn't heard in 40 years. What began as a simple meal unraveled a buried family secret, a vanished woman, and a story the world had almost forgotten. But why did she disappear? And why now, after all this time? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was just an ordinary afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, the kind where traffic hummed like a restless tide and the sidewalks blurred with faces caught in routines. Keanu Reeves, dressed simply in a dark hoodie and jeans, had stepped away from a nearby soundstage where filming had wrapped for the morning. He wasn't being followed by cameras or fans this time, just walking alone, his thoughts somewhere quieter than the chaos around him. He liked these walks, no destination, no plan, just the rhythm of his footsteps and the occasional nod to someone passing by. On this particular day, a soft breeze moved through the streets, lifting scraps of old newspaper and the scent of grilled tacos from a nearby cart. He walked past a row of benches nestled between a thrift store and a shuttered bakery. That's when he saw her. She was older, maybe in her 70s, a thin frame wrapped in a patchy blanket, gray hair tied back loosely. She sat on the far end of a bench, sketching something in a worn notebook with a blue pencil stub. She didn't look up. She wasn't panhandling. There was no sign, no outstretched hand, just her, quietly drawing, like the city noise. Keanu slowed. There was something about the way her shoulders curved inward, the way her fingers clutched the edge of the page. Not trembling, but practiced. Familiar. He took a step closer, then hesitated. He wasn't one to interrupt people's silence. Still, something in him didn't want to just keep walking. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you hungry?" She paused, still not looking at him. "I was about to grab something for lunch. There's a diner a block away, nothing fancy, but it's warm inside." For a few seconds, she didn't respond. Then she looked up. Her eyes were the color of river stones, calm, distant, and tired. She studied his face not with suspicion, but with a strange softness, as if she were trying to remember something just out of reach. Finally, she nodded once. He extended a hand, helping her up gently. She clutched her notebook close to her chest as they walked. The diner was quiet, half-seal, with regulars and the occasional delivery driver. Keanu chose a booth in the back and let her sit first. A waitress came by with menus and coffee. They ordered simple meals, grilled cheese for her, soup and a sandwich for him. For the first few minutes, neither said much. She ate slowly, precisely. He watched her, sensing a familiarity he couldn't quite name. Her hands were calloused but careful. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft and low. "I used to know a boy," she said, breaking a piece of crust from her sandwich. "He looked just like you." Keanu tilted his head. "In Toronto," she added quietly. "Long time ago." His name was Keanu. His heart skipped. He hadn't said his name. She turned and looked directly at him. "Your mother called me Lucia." Keanu didn't move at first. The air between them shifted. He hadn't heard that name in decades, not spoken like this, not connected to the years before Hollywood, before all the noise and cameras. Lucia. It echoed through a closed-off corner of his childhood, the part with shadows and gaps no one ever talked about. He leaned forward slightly, his voice careful. "Lucia," he said, testing it out loud. "Lucia from Summerhill Avenue?" Her expression remained still, but a flicker of something, relief, recognition, passed through her eyes. "You had a red plastic race car," she said, "and you used to leave it parked next to the laundry hamper. I stepped on it once. You cried like your foot had been crushed, but then you offered me your last popsicle." Keanu's breath caught. That memory wasn't just real. It was private. a tiny, buried scene he hadn't shared with anyone. He stared at her, and slowly, she reached into her faded coat and pulled out the sketch pad. She turned it around. On the page was a pencil drawing of a hallway, a child's hallway. Worn floorboards, a low bookshelf, and on the edge of the rug, a toy race car. The detail was exact, down to the shape of the plastic wheels. "I used to draw to remember," she said quietly. "And when I had nowhere left to go, I kept drawing. Places I had loved, people I had cared for." Keanu felt something shift in his chest, a dull ache he hadn't expected. His eyes flicked down to her hands, the way she cradled the sketch pad like it was the last fragile thing in her life. "Lucia," he said again, "I thought you moved away. One day, you were just gone." She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tightening around the cup. "I didn't leave. I was told not to come back." Silence. Keanu's voice dropped. "Told? By who?" Lucia took a long breath. "It doesn't matter now. You were just a little boy. And I loved you like you were mine." The weight of those words settled between them. The diner felt suddenly too bright, too loud. Keanu sat back, heart thudding, trying to process the collision of memory and reality. This woman, the quiet figure with the blanket and the sketch pad, had once been part of his family's house, had watched over him, and she had vanished without explanation. Just a sudden absence no one had ever clarified. Lucia picked at the edge of her napkin. "I didn't come here to find you," she said. "I didn't know you'd be in this city. I was just trying to stay warm." He stared at her. "Why now? Why this bench? What made you draw that hallway?" She shrugged slightly. "Some places never leave you, even if you're told to forget." Keanu's throat tightened. He looked at the sketch again, then at the woman before him. She was older, her features worn from time and weather, but there was something unmistakable in her eyes. A steady warmth, a quiet strength he hadn't seen in years. "Lucia, where have you been all this time?" She paused, then said softly, "Everywhere and nowhere. Shelters, hospitals, sometimes just the street. After Toronto, I tried to start over in Montreal, then Vancouver, then here. But why didn't you—" He trailed off, unsure what he was even asking. "Call? Write? Reach out?" "I lost everything," she said simply. "Not just the job, my papers, my home, and no one really cared. Not enough to ask the right questions." She gently closed her sketch pad, folding her napkin with deliberate care. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Keanu. Please believe that. I saw you today, and I recognized the way you walked. That's all. I didn't expect you to remember me." Keanu looked at her, really looked. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had found a missing page from his childhood. One no one had ever explained. One he didn't know he needed back. Until now. "You were kind to me," he said. "I remember that much. You taught me how to fold towels. You made me toast with cinnamon and sugar when I was sick." Lucia smiled faintly. "And you gave me a rock once. You said it was from the moon." He chuckled, surprised by the memory. "It was probably from the backyard. Still, I kept it in my apron pocket for years." A silence stretched between them. But it wasn't awkward. It felt reverent, full of everything they didn't yet know how to say. "I'm not letting you go back to that bench," Keanu said quietly. "You're coming with me." Lucia shook her head, but he could already see tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "I don't want to cause you trouble," she said. "People talk. They'll say you're only helping me because you feel guilty." Keanu leaned forward. "Let them talk." She stared at him, stunned into silence. He stood, reached for the check and nodded toward the door. "Come on. You're not invisible anymore, Lucia." As they stepped outside into the Los Angeles sun, Lucia hesitated for just a moment, then followed. Not as a stranger, not as a ghost from the past, but as someone seen again, at last. Keanu sat in the quiet stillness of his hotel room, the lights of downtown Los Angeles flickering just beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below hummed with its usual chaos, but all he could think about was the woman with the lined face and soft voice, the one who had whispered a name he hadn't heard in decades. Lucia. He remembered the hallway first, a narrow stretch in their Toronto apartment, patterned with morning light that spilled through the curtains. He used to slide across its wooden floor in his socks, arms stretched like airplane wings. And always, a soft humming came from the end of that hallway, a melody not from the radio or television, but from the woman folding towels or brushing dust from the windowsills. She never raised her voice, never rushed him. She moved like someone who didn't want to wake the world, like peace had to be preserved moment by moment. She was the one who taught him to tie his shoes, who made a warm drink when he couldn't sleep, who once whispered that stars didn't disappear at sunrise. They just waited their turn again. Then, one day, she was gone. No goodbyes, no explanations, just gone. His mother had been quiet when he asked. She changed the subject. Lucia had to leave, she'd said once, vaguely, and nothing more. At the time, Keanu had assumed she'd taken another job or moved away. But as he got older, he realized no adult had ever filled in the blanks. And as years blurred into decades, the memory faded into a soft ache. Until today. Now the past had a face again, older, worn by life, but unmistakably familiar. And her voice, cracked but gentle, had cut through all the noise like the opening line of a long-forgotten song. He stared at the empty takeout bag from lunch, still resting on the hotel table. The sandwich had long gone cold by the time he'd finished it, but he remembered every word she'd said. Her hands had trembled slightly as she touched her tea, eyes scanning his features as if searching for proof. "A boy named Keanu," she'd whispered. "Your mother called me Lucia." His chest tightened. He had to see her again, ask the questions he never knew he needed answered. The next morning, Keanu returned to the same street corner, the one where he'd seen her sketching alone. He walked slower this time, scanning the benches, the alleys, every quiet storefront still waiting to open, but she wasn't there. He checked across the street. No sign of the weathered gray coat or the lavender scarf. The sidewalk where she had sat felt colder now, like her presence had softened something invisible in the air. And without her, the world had snapped back into its sharper edges. He waited nearly an hour. At one point, he bought coffee from the corner cart and gave an extra to a young man resting on the curb. Still no sign of her. As he turned to leave, heart heavy, he noticed something tucked between the slats of the bench. The same one where she'd sat sketching. A notebook. Keanu hesitated, then picked it up gently, holding it as if it might vanish. The cover was worn canvas, edges frayed. He sat down and flipped to the first page. His breath caught. It was a pencil drawing, a hallway. His hallway. The one from childhood, wooden floors and all. His little tricycle leaned against the wall in the image. A houseplant to the side. It was sketched with such care it looked like a memory pressed into paper. He turned the next page. The kitchen. Same checkered floor, same sun through the window. There was a mug on the table, his favorite as a kid, with chipped paint in the shape of a dragonfly. More pages followed. The living room, the balcony, even a drawing of the dog they had briefly owned when he was 6. All drawn with the eye of someone who had lived in those spaces. Remembered them. Page after page, Lucia had sketched moments frozen in time. But on one page, her lines shifted. A drawing of a young boy, barefoot, lying on his stomach, with a comic book. the label beneath in soft cursive, "My Little Astronaut." Keanu's hand hovered over the page. He remembered that comic. He remembered lying there, chin in his palms, dreaming of stars. And he remembered her voice behind him, humming something soft. Always humming. Toward the back of the notebook was a page with no drawings. Just 2 lines, written in slightly shakier handwriting. Marisol Calderon, Fresno. "If anything happens to me, find her." He read it twice. Marisol Calderon. Who was she? A daughter? A relative? Someone Lucia had been searching for? Keanu closed the notebook, fingers tightening around its spine. He couldn't ignore this. It was more than nostalgia now. It was a life, a trail of sketches leading somewhere deeper. And he felt, with growing certainty, that Lucia hadn't just reappeared in his life. She had resurfaced for a reason. He stood and called someone he hadn't contacted in years. A trusted investigator he once worked with. Quietly during a charity search for missing persons. "Her name is Lucia," Keanu said. "I need to know who Marisol Calderon is. And I need to find her fast." The investigator called back the next afternoon. Keanu had barely slept the night before. The notebook sat open on his table, a candle burning beside it, casting shadows over the hallway sketch. Each time he looked at it, he could almost hear Lucia humming again. It was strange how a few pencil strokes could reach backward and unlock something as sacred as childhood, something unspoken. The call came just as sunlight poured into the kitchen of his rental home. "I found a record," the investigator said. "It's thin, spotty, but it's something." Keanu pressed the phone closer. Lucia Alvarez, formerly of Toronto, worked under the table for several families in the 1980s and early 90s. No official immigration paperwork until much later. She disappeared from public records around 1991. Keanu's stomach twisted. But this name, Marisol Calderon, it shows up once. In an ER admittance file from Fresno 1992, the patient was listed as Lucia Alvarez. Emergency contact Marisol Calderon. No age listed, just a child. "A child?" Keanu asked softly. "Possibly a daughter. Or niece. It was a domestic assault case. Lucia was discharged and then vanished from all records again. No follow-up, nothing." The silence was heavy. "Do you want me to keep digging?" Keanu's jaw tightened. "Yes. Everything you can find on Marisol Calderon. Alive, missing, married, anything. And," he hesitated, "if you find Lucia again, tell me first. No police, no news, just me." He ended the call and sat still for a long time, the weight of the information sinking in like wet sand around his feet. A hospital, a child, an emergency contact. That wasn't someone who just quit a job. That was someone who had been erased. He opened the notebook again, this time scanning the sketches for something he hadn't noticed before. And there it was, on one page of the kitchen, tucked in the corner of the drawing. A small, almost hidden signature. A child's handwriting. Marisol. It had always been there, right under the windowsill, right in the home he thought he remembered completely. Now that memory had a new shadow and a new name. Keanu stood slowly and whispered to the quiet room, "I'm going to find you both." The rain had passed by the time Keanu sat alone at his kitchen table, Lucier's worn notebook resting in his hands. He hadn't opened it fully the first night, not beyond the sketch that had shaken him, an exact replica of the stained glass window from his childhood home, the one by the staircase where sunlight once streamed in and colored the floor in shifting rainbows. But now, with the city quiet and his thoughts too loud to ignore, he opened the notebook again. The first few pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting. Not journal entries exactly, but moments, little lines of poetry, fragments of prayer, and dated entries that read more like offerings than observations. Each page whispered something private. El niño con los ojos tranquilos. Que nunca olvide lo amado que. The boy with quiet eyes. May he never forget how deeply he was loved. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. He turned the page. A familiar lullaby in Spanish. Lucia had sung that to him during nights when he couldn't sleep. He could still hear her voice, soft and sure, filling the hallway outside his room like a protective veil. He had forgotten the words, but never the warmth. On another page, she'd written, "There is no one to speak for the quiet women, so I will speak with ink and paper." That's when he noticed more drawings. Their family's kitchen. His mother's vanity. A view of the backyard swing that had rusted over time. None of them were perfect or polished, but they were all unmistakably real. Scenes no camera had captured. Only a heart who'd lived there would remember them. Keanu sat back and closed his eyes. Lucia had been more than a nanny. She had been safety. He remembered her helping him learn to tie his shoes, placing her hand gently on his back when he was nervous before his first school play. She always smelled like rose water and cinnamon. She never raised her voice. She was just there. Until suddenly, she wasn't. His brows furrowed. Why hadn't he asked where she went? Why hadn't anyone told him? He picked up the phone and called the only person who might help him remember. His sister, Kim. Kim answered on the third ring. Her voice was warm, but surprised. "Keanu? It's late. Everything okay?" "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Do you remember Lucia?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that stretches out not because someone doesn't remember, but because they do, and remembering hurts. "You mean Lucia from Toronto? From when we were kids?" "Yes." Kim exhaled slowly. "Of course I remember her. What do you remember?" "I was maybe 5 or 6. I scraped my knees trying to race my bike down the driveway. You were the one who told me I couldn't ride fast in flip-flops, remember?" Her voice had a faint smile in it. "Lucia cleaned me up. I remember she sang while she did it. Spanish words I didn't understand, but it made me feel brave. I remember how soft her hands were. I used to pretend she was my real mom." Keanu blinked against the sudden well of emotion in his eyes. Kim continued, "But one day she was just gone. Did Mom ever say why?" Another long pause. "She told me never to bring her up again. I tried once. Maybe a year after Lucia left. I asked why we never heard from her again. Mom shut it down so fast I got scared to ask again." Keanu felt his heartbeat quicken. "Why would she do that?" "I don't know. But I do remember something else. The night before Lucia disappeared, I heard voices, raised voices. It was late, and I had snuck into the hallway to get a glass of water. I couldn't make out all the words, just that it was Mom and someone else. A man's voice, loud, angry." Keanu's hand tightened around the phone. "I think it was one of Mom's boyfriends," Kim said softly. "She dated a guy back then who made me nervous. You remember Ron?" Keanu nodded, even though she couldn't see him. There was yelling. Then, silence. And in the morning, Lucia was gone. Her things, too. I asked Mom where she went. She said she wasn't the right fit for this house. And that was it. "She was more than the right fit," Keanu whispered. "She was the only soft thing in that house." They sat in silence on the phone for a while, both of them piecing together a puzzle that had been locked away in memory. Then Kim asked, "Why are you asking about her now?" "Because I saw her." "You saw Lucia?" Keanu nodded again, this time more to himself than to her. "She's homeless. Downtown LA. I bought her lunch. She remembered me." "Oh my God, Keanu." "She left a notebook behind. It's filled with drawings. And her name, her full name, I'm trying to find her again, really find her. You're doing the right thing, Kim said softly. You always were the one who couldn't let things go. No, he replied, his voice almost breaking. I was the one who never saw what was right in front of me. After the call with Kim, Keanu sat with the notebook on his lap, his fingers resting gently on its worn cover. He opened it again and flipped toward the back. One of the pages stood out. Not a drawing this time, but a list. The ink was faded but legible. It looked like a list of names. He recognized none of them, except one. Marisol Calderon. The name was circled twice. Beneath it, scribbled in a different pen, were two words. Mi niña. My girl. Keanu's eyes lingered on the name. He thought of Lucia, alone on that bench, sketching quietly. The way she had looked at him, not with pity or request, but with recognition, with love. Who was Marisol? His mind traced back to his childhood home in Toronto. He didn't remember another child. No one had ever mentioned a daughter. But maybe that was the point. Maybe no one had cared to ask Lucia what she'd left behind when she disappeared. Keanu stood up suddenly. The need to act surged through him. He couldn't let this trail go cold, not again. He pulled out his phone and contacted his assistant. I need a private investigator, he said. Someone discreet and fast. That night, Keanu barely slept. He sat by his window watching the dark sky shift toward morning, Lucia's notebook still resting beside him. A different kind of weight filled him now. Not the hollow weight of guilt, but something heavier and more urgent. Responsibility. He wasn't sure where this path would lead. He only knew he couldn't walk away from it. Not this time. The investigator's message came in late on a Thursday evening. Keanu had just finished a quiet dinner alone, still thinking about Lucia's notebook, the feel of its worn pages, and the weight of memory it carried. The message was brief. Found a Marisol Calderon, nurse, lives in Sacramento, age matches, possible daughter. Want me to proceed? Keanu stared at the text for a long time before replying. He didn't want this search to become an intrusion, or worse, a reopening of old wounds that had never healed. But something inside him, something deeper than curiosity, whispered that he owed it to both Lucia and Marisol to follow through. He responded, yes, but gently. Let me reach out myself. The next morning, he sat in his trailer on set, staring at a blank message on his phone for over an hour. Then, he began typing. Hi Marisol. I hope this message finds you well. I know this may come as a surprise, and I want to be respectful of your time and boundaries. My name is Keanu Reeves. I believe your mother may have worked in my childhood home many years ago in Toronto. Her name was Lucia. I recently came across her name again in an unexpected way. I would like to meet with you, only if you're comfortable, just to share something I think might matter to both of us. He paused, then added, no expectations, just the possibility of connection. The message was sent. Keanu didn't tell anyone. Not his team, not his sister, not his publicist. This wasn't for headlines or reconciliation speeches. This was personal. Marisol replied 3 days later, Mr. Reeves, thank you for reaching out. I was surprised, yes, but also curious. I haven't heard my mother's name from anyone outside my family in decades. I'd be willing to meet, briefly. I work long hours, but I'm off Thursday morning. There's a quiet cafe on the edge of old Sacramento called Sunlight and Sage, 10:00 IMA. He arrived 10 minutes early. The cafe was small, filled with plants and sun-faded wooden tables. The scent of rosemary and coffee lingered in the air. He chose a seat in the back, away from the windows, and waited. No entourage, no cameras. Just a man hoping to bridge a gap he hadn't even known existed until a week ago. At 10:05, a woman entered, with a nurse's badge still clipped to her scrubs. mid-40s, with tired eyes and a calm presence. She saw him and hesitated. Then she walked over and introduced herself. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked gently. "Yes," he replied, standing. "I almost didn't come," she admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "But the way you worded your message, I don't know, it felt real." Keanu nodded, unsure how to begin. "I'm not here to stir anything up," he said, "only to understand. And to share something I found. Something that belongs to you." Marisol kept her eyes on him, guarded but open. Her hands were folded tightly on the table. Keanu reached into his jacket and slowly pulled out the notebook. The same one Lucia had left behind on the bench in Los Angeles. Its cover was worn and soft with time. The pages curled slightly at the corners. He placed it gently on the table between them. "I believe this belonged to your mother," he said. Marisol didn't move at first. Then she reached forward, her fingers brushing the cover. A breath caught in her throat. She opened it slowly, turning each page with a kind of reverence, as if touching something sacred. The sketches, the prayers, the half-written letters. Each one seemed to draw her deeper into a memory she'd spent a lifetime trying to preserve. "She always carried a notebook," Marisol whispered. "She used to draw on the bus rides. Said it helped her stay grounded. Even when we had nothing, she always had paper and a pencil." She turned to a page with a faded sketch of a small, curly-haired girl playing near a garden wall. Her voice cracked. "That's me." Keanu said nothing. There were no words that could match the weight of that moment. Marisol wiped her eyes and kept turning pages. Then she paused at one with delicate handwriting in Spanish. A prayer, addressed not to God, but to her daughter. "Marisol, wherever you are, I pray you are safe. I pray you are loved. I will find you again, I promise." Her voice trembled. She never stopped looking. Keanu sat forward gently. "What happened? If you don't mind sharing. I only know that one day she was gone." Marisol nodded slowly, gathering herself. "She left Toronto with me when I was 7. She said it wasn't safe anymore. That something happened in the house where she worked. Something she couldn't stay quiet about." Keanu's breath caught. "My house?" Marisol didn't answer directly. "She never gave me details, but she was scared. Said someone told her to disappear or she'd be deported. Back then, there were no protections. No one believed a domestic worker's word over a wealthy family." Keanu leaned back in his seat, the weight of it pressing on him. "I was just a boy," he said quietly. "I didn't understand any of it." Marisol looked at him, softer now. "Neither did I." There was a long silence between them, filled not with awkwardness, but with quiet understanding. Then she asked, "Where did you find this?" Keanu told her about the bench downtown, the unexpected conversation, the lunch that changed everything. "She recognized you?" Marisol asked. She said. "I used to know a boy named Keanu. Your mother called me Lucia, and I froze. I hadn't heard that name in decades." Marisol closed the notebook and held it close to her chest. "I thought she was dead," she whispered. "For years I lit candles for her." Keanu's voice was barely above a breath. "She's still alive." Marisol sat back, her arms still wrapped tightly around the notebook, as if letting go might make the moment vanish. Her eyes were wide, trembling on the edge of disbelief. "You saw her? Recently?" Keanu nodded. "Just a few days ago. She looked older, tired. But her eyes, her spirit, there was still something strong in her, something unbroken." Marisol's voice cracked again. "Where is she now?" "I went back the next morning, but she was gone. She'd left the notebook behind. I've been trying to find her since." Marisol swallowed, her face contorting as tears welled again. "I searched shelters for years, asked churches, called hospitals. No one knew anything. I thought maybe she didn't want to be found. Keanu hesitated, then said, I think she did, just not through the systems that failed her. Maybe she was waiting for the right moment, or the right person. A waitress refilled their coffee, oblivious to the storm gently unfolding at the table. Marisol thanked her quietly, then turned back to Keanu. You're sure it was her? Keanu reached into his wallet and pulled out a photo he'd discreetly taken before she left. It wasn't staged or posed, just Lucia on the bench, her head tilted slightly as she looked down at her sketchbook, hair streaked with gray, blanket draped around her shoulders. Marisol stared at it. A soft, aching noise escaped her lips. That's her. Oh my God, that's my mother. She passed the photo back and pressed her palms to her eyes. She always said she'd find me, that we'd be together again. And I gave up. Keanu spoke gently. You didn't give up. You just ran out of ways. But now, maybe there's one more. Marisol looked up. Do you think she'd want to see me? I think, Keanu said carefully, she never stopped sketching the life she left behind. You were in every corner of that notebook. They sat there for a long while. Marisol let herself cry without apology, while Keanu stayed still, present, honoring the weight of it. When she finally composed herself again, she asked, Why are you doing this? You could have walked away. Keanu shook his head. I can't explain it exactly, but when I looked into her eyes, something opened in me. A memory, maybe. Or guilt. Or a connection that never fully left. I just knew. I had to help her, and help you. Marisol nodded slowly. Then let's find her. Together. The words were soft, but they carried purpose. Keanu rose, offering his hand. We'll start with every shelter in the area, one by one if we have to. Marisol stood, notebook still cradled in her arm. I've been waiting for this moment most of my life. As they stepped out of the cafe into the California sunlight, the past didn't seem so far away anymore. Lucia was only 19 when she first arrived in Toronto. Fresh from Honduras, she stepped off the plane with a worn suitcase, a pocket full of pesos exchanged at the airport, and a photograph of her daughter folded carefully in her wallet. Marisol had just turned 3. Lucia whispered a promise to the photo as she boarded the connecting bus. Her first job came quickly through a community board posting, live-in nanny for a family in Rosedale. The pay was modest, but housing and meals were included. She accepted gratefully. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was how quickly love and loneliness would mix in this new land. The house on Glen Road was grand but cold. The children, Keanu and Kim, were sweet, both under 10, curious and affectionate in the way only children untouched by cynicism could be. Keanu liked to sit quietly while she folded laundry, asking questions about constellations and humming along to the old folk songs she sang under her breath. Kim brought her dandelions from the yard, insisting they were rare flowers. Lucia treasured those moments more than anyone knew. The adults were another story. The mother was distant but polite. The father was gone more than he was present. And the extended guests? Well, that's where the trouble began. It happened late one evening after dinner. One of the father's colleagues visiting from Montreal had stayed over after a party. The children were in bed, the house dim. Lucia was cleaning the kitchen when the man cornered her. His breath reeked of whiskey. She froze. When she said no, his response was laughter and something cruel muttered in French. He didn't stop until the creak of a stair startled him away. Lucia told the mother the next morning. She whispered the story, terrified and shaking. The reaction was swift and quiet. We can't have scandal, the woman said calmly, pouring tea. You'll be given a week's pay and escorted to the train. I suggest you take it. Lucia didn't fight. Her world collapsed inward. That day, she packed her things, took her modest savings, and left the house without saying goodbye to the children. she still remembered Keanu's face, confused and searching from the upstairs window as the taxi pulled away. Shame wrapped itself around her like a second skin. She couldn't go back to Honduras. Not like this, not empty-handed. And she couldn't face her daughter knowing she'd lost her job, her purpose, her dignity, all in one instant. So she vanished. Lucia spent the next few years drifting. Shelters, church basements, and the kindness of strangers kept her afloat in the shadows of a city that had once felt full of promise. She took short-term jobs, cleaning offices at night, washing dishes in cafes, sometimes minding children for cash under the table. But she never stayed long. There was always the fear of being reported, the fear of being asked for identification, the fear of being seen too clearly. She wrote letters to Marisol that she never mailed, scribbled apologies on the backs of food receipts, notes folded between library books. Mi amor, I am still trying. Forgive me for not being stronger. I dream of your voice. But every time she tried to send them, shame clawed her back. What kind of mother disappears for years? What kind of mother lets herself be erased? By the time Marisol turned 12, Lucia had learned to survive without hope. She worked in a garment factory for 5 years, then a bakery in Kensington Market. She stopped singing. She stopped writing. She moved silently through the days, invisible by choice and necessity. Then, as if guided by fate, she began sketching again. At first it was just idle doodles, buses, faces, the curve of rooftops. But soon, her hand found the shapes of memories. A boy with quiet eyes staring out a rainy window. A little girl holding a bouquet of weeds like they were precious gems. Her fingers remembered what her voice had buried. The notebook became her only companion, each page a thread to a life that had once been hers. She never remarried, never told anyone the full truth. For decades, she stayed on the margins, weaving together a quiet life of solitude. She worked just enough to get by, slept in boarding houses, and eventually ended up in Los Angeles when one of the women from her church group relocated and offered her a room. But the years aged her faster than time should have. Her back ached. Her joints stiffened. Her mind wandered. And then, one day, she lost her housing. That's when Keanu found her on that bench. Lucia had recognized him instantly, the way he moved, the quiet patience, the slight furrow in his brow. She hadn't dared to speak until he bought her lunch and sat across from her with a kindness that brought the old memories surging back. She didn't mean to say his name. It just escaped, like breath returning after years beneath the surface. Now, in the present, Keanu sat in his home, notebook in hand, stunned. Each sketch, each page, each word written in trembling cursive felt like a message across time. A voice he hadn't known he missed until he heard it again. Kim's words echoed too. Mom told me never to bring her up again. Something terrible had happened. Something his family had buried. He turned a page and found a line written in Spanish. He didn't recognize all the words, but one phrase was underlined twice. Lo que se ocula no deja de doler. What is hidden does not stop hurting. He reached for his phone and texted his assistant. Please schedule time tomorrow. I want to talk to that investigator again. Lucia's silence had lasted a lifetime, but it was time someone spoke the truth. The next morning, Keanu drove across the city, notebook in hand, and met Marisol at a small park near her hospital. They sat on a weathered bench under the shade of a jacaranda tree. Its blossoms had just begun to fall, purple petals drifting between them like silent witnesses. He handed her the notebook without a word. She opened it slowly. As her fingers turned each page, her lips trembled. There were drawings of a boy with soft eyes, a little girl with a scraped knee, a hallway bathed in afternoon light, and then, near the back, a page with a date, July 14, 1981, and a single sentence written beneath it. I kissed her forehead that night and whispered goodbye. Marisol's hands shook. "I thought she left because of me," she said softly. "I thought maybe I was too loud, or I cried too much, or she didn't love me enough." His eyes filled. "No, none of that. She didn't stop loving you. She was trying to protect you." Marisol nodded, swallowing hard. "Then we both lived most of our lives thinking we'd been abandoned." They sat in silence for a while. The truth was a wound, but it was also a doorway. A quiet, painful beginning to healing what had been broken for far too long. The early morning haze hung low over the Los Angeles hills as Keanu sat on the edge of his modest porch, staring out into the soft gray light. The notebook still rested in his lap, Lucia's careful script echoing like a soft pulse beneath the pages. But it wasn't her voice that haunted him now. It was the silence that surrounded her. A silence he'd grown up inside without ever questioning, and now it roared. He hadn't spoken to many people about his mother's death. It had been a quiet goodbye, held privately in a forested cemetery in Toronto, a small circle of friends, a few former colleagues. But as the years passed, questions she'd never answered began to surface in ways he couldn't ignore anymore. Lucia had been part of their home, part of his childhood. And then one day she was gone. No explanation, no discussion, just absence. He found himself dialing a number he hadn't used in years. A family friend, now in her 70s, who had once shared Sunday brunches with them in their old Toronto home. Her name was Miriam Ortiz, a neighbor from 2 houses down. She had been the kind of adult who always noticed things children weren't supposed to notice. When she picked up the phone, her voice cracked from age, but carried its familiar warmth. "Miriam, it's Keanu. I was wondering if we could talk. It's about someone who worked with us, a nanny, Lucia." There was a long pause on the line, then a quiet sigh. "Oh, Keanu, I wondered when that would come back around." The word struck something deep in his chest. They met the next morning in a quiet cafe outside the city. Miriam looked older than he remembered, thinner too, her white hair swept into a careful bun, but her eyes were sharp, attentive. "She was a good woman," Miriam said after a sip of tea. "Quiet, gentle, the kind of person who didn't take up space, even when she should have." "Do you know why she left?" Keanu asked, voice tight. Miriam folded her hands. "I don't know the full story, but I remember that week. There was a visitor. Your uncle's business partner, I think. Lucia looked shaken the morning after he came, and the next day, she was gone." She leaned forward, eyes steady. "I heard whispers, that she said something. And someone decided it would be simpler if she disappeared quietly. No police, no report, just gone." Keanu's jaw clenched. "My mother?" Miriam nodded slowly. "There were things people didn't want to deal with back then. The reputation of a family was everything, especially when your father had already left and she was doing everything to keep things stable." He sat in stunned silence. The gentle hum of the cafe seemed to grow louder in his ears. It was true, all of it, and no one had done anything. That afternoon, Keanu drove north. Not for work, not for a press event, just silence. The winding highway took him through the hills and into the quiet green of the cemetery where his mother rested. The gate clicked behind him as he walked in, hands in his coat pockets, heart dragging behind him like a long shadow. The headstone was modest, just her name, the dates, and a small inscription that read, "She believed in beauty." He stood there for a long time before sitting on the grass beside her. He looked down, unsure where to start. "Mom," he said finally, barely above a whisper, "I need to say something you never gave me the chance to say. Or maybe you never gave yourself the chance to hear." His hands trembled in his lap. "Lucia was part of our family. Maybe not in name or blood or title, but she mattered. And I think you knew something happened to her. I don't know why you let her go without a word. I don't know if you were scared, or angry, or just trying to hold it all together." He swallowed. "But she didn't vanish. You erased her." The wind shifted through the trees behind him. Leaves danced quietly over the grass. "Loved us. And we failed her. I failed her." His voice broke. There were no cameras, no scripts, no audience, just truth and a grave. "I'm going to make it right. Not for guilt, not for legacy. For her, for the people like her, the ones who disappear in silence." He stood, brushing off his knees. His heart felt heavier and lighter at the same time. The grief wasn't new, but now it had a name, it had a face, and it had a path forward. Back in his car, Keanu couldn't stop thinking about the unspoken lives of women like Lucia. Immigrant workers, domestic caregivers, the invisible scaffolding holding up families while being denied dignity themselves. He went home and began reading. Long into the night, he pored over articles and public reports. He read about loopholes in domestic labor protections, especially in the 1970S and 80S. Stories of women whose visas were revoked without notice. Women who endured abuse and disappeared because no one tracked them. They weren't seen as essential. They were seen as temporary. He found a Harvard study on historical systemic failure in protecting undocumented caregivers, particularly women of color, who reported abuse and were either deported or lost custody of their children. The parallels were crushing. He closed his laptop and stared out the window. Lucia wasn't an exception. She was part of a pattern. And for the first time, Keanu understood that what happened to her wasn't just a family secret. It was part of a national silence, one he couldn't ignore anymore. The next morning, Keanu sat quietly in his kitchen, nursing a cup of tea. A legal pad lay open in front of him, filled with scribbles and questions. At the top, underlined twice, was a single phrase. How many Lucias are still out there? He couldn't let this go. Later that day, he reached out to a friend, Daniel Sue, a civil rights attorney who'd once helped him discreetly fund scholarships for first-generation college students. Daniel was smart, grounded, and knew how to navigate both the legal world and the human one. When they met at a quiet cafe in West Hollywood, Keanu didn't waste time. "I want to do something," he said, eyes steady. "Something real. Not just a donation. I want to understand what we can build." Daniel listened carefully as Keanu told him about Lucia, about Marisol, about the missing years and the silences no one dared to break. When Keanu finished, Daniel leaned forward. "What you're talking about isn't just justice for one woman. It's acknowledging a buried epidemic. If we can trace systemic negligence, maybe we can start something. A foundation, a visibility campaign, policy change." Keanu nodded. No names, no press, just a place to start. Something that says, "We see them now." They spent hours drafting ideas. Daniel suggested building a small legal and mental health support network for women in domestic caregiving roles, especially older women with unresolved cases, records lost to time, a mobile legal unit, trauma counseling, immigration legal aid. Keanu added a thought, and stories. They need to be heard. They drafted a plan to start collecting anonymous oral histories, testimonies from women who'd never been asked what they lived through. Keanu promised to fund the first 2 years himself, quietly. That night, Keanu walked alone near Venice Beach, the sky open and salted with stars. He watched the waves roll in and imagined Lucia standing nearby, her faded notebook under her arm, still humming. In his mind, he saw her gently brushing crumbs from little Keanu's lap, saw her rocking Marisol in a borrowed blanket, saw her walking away from a house that never said thank you, a house that forgot. But he hadn't forgotten. And now, neither would the world. For the first time in days, he didn't feel haunted. He felt summoned, not to fix the past, but to illuminate it, so others wouldn't have to live under the same shadow. The world had failed Lucia, but he wouldn't. Not again. Keanu Reeves stood outside the faded brick building of the St. Bridget Women's Clinic in East Hollywood, hands deep in his coat pockets. He had visited the place quietly, without an assistant, without cameras, just as he always did when something truly mattered. He had been told Lucia Alvarez came here sometimes when the pain in her knees or the cough in her chest flared up. No guarantee she'd be here today, but something in him wouldn't let it go. He waited on the narrow sidewalk, the wind tugging at his sleeves. Then, just after noon, the clinic door opened. Lucia stepped out slowly, wearing the same woven scarf from that day on the bench. Her hair was longer now, thinner, caught in a soft braid. She moved carefully, her cane steadying each step. Keanu exhaled with a tremble he hadn't realized he was holding in. He approached without fanfare. "Lucia," he said softly. She turned, surprised but not startled. Her eyes, older now but still calm, landed on him with quiet recognition. "You came." They sat on a bench in the courtyard behind the clinic, shaded by a jacaranda tree. He offered to take her somewhere more comfortable. A coffee shop, a quiet diner, but she shook her head gently. "This place is quiet enough," she said, "and safe." Lucia's voice was gentle but clear. She asked how his sister Kim was, and smiled when he said she was thriving. Then, almost shyly, she said, "I watched your movies sometimes. I didn't see them in theaters, but sometimes they played on small TVs in waiting rooms or church basements. I'd smile when I saw you were kind, even on screen." Keanu's throat tightened. He wanted to say 100 things, that he was sorry, that she had been missed, that her disappearance had changed something in him, even if he hadn't known it. But she wasn't looking for apologies. "I never imagined I'd speak to you again," she said, watching the tree's blossoms sway above them. "But I'm glad. Thank you for the meal that day. I didn't recognize you at first, not until you smiled." Keanu nodded. "I meant what I said. I want to help. I want to make sure you're okay." She looked away, not out of rudeness, but to protect him. "I'm old, Keanu. I've lived a long time in the shadows. I don't need fame. I don't want attention. But there are others, many others, who are still in those shadows." He leaned forward. "Then help me find them." Lucia met his eyes again. "Not everyone wants to be found, but some are waiting for someone to ask. If you want to help, don't do it in my name. Don't make it about me. Do it for the ones still hiding, the ones too scared to speak." Keanu placed a hand over hers, firm and quiet. "Then, that's what I'll do." Lucia's hand trembled beneath his, but she didn't pull away. Lucia's hand rested lightly on her lap as she looked at the cracked concrete beneath their feet. Keanu remained beside her, not pushing, just listening. She began to speak again, slowly, as if dredging up fragments long buried. "There was a time I thought I might be someone," she murmured. "I loved taking care of you kids. I sang while I cleaned. Your sister would dance. You were the quiet one, always watching. I used to call you my little owl." Keanu gave a small, breathy laugh. "I didn't know that." Lucia smiled. "You wouldn't. I only said it to myself." They sat in silence for a while before Keanu gently asked, "Why didn't you come back?" Lucia's shoulders rose with the weight of memory. "Because they told me I couldn't. I was shamed, blamed. They said it would be easier if I disappeared. I had nowhere to go that wouldn't cost me my daughter." Keanu's eyes darkened. "You thought they'd take Marisol." "I was undocumented," she said quietly. "No voice, no power. The man who hurt me had more money than I'd ever seen. He could have buried me with a single phone call. Keanu sat back, fists curled in his lap. He thought about the system that had failed her. How many others had it silenced? How many lives had gone unnoticed because it was more convenient for powerful people to ignore pain? I've lived in shelters, motels, basements, she continued. I cleaned houses under other names. I kept a low profile. There were nights I dreamed of Marisol's face. I'd imagine her laugh, her first job, her first love. I thought staying away was protecting her. But I think I broke her heart instead. Keanu's voice was soft. She doesn't hate you, she misses you. Lucia's face twitched with surprise, then deep emotion. You've spoken to her? I found her, he said. She's doing well, she's strong. A nurse. She still remembers you, still loves you. Tears welled in Lucia's eyes, and her hand clutched her scarf at the collarbone. I don't deserve her forgiveness. You don't need to deserve it, Keanu replied. You just need to meet her. Lucia turned to him, eyes wide. I'm not ready. You don't have to be. Not yet. But she wants to see you, and when you're ready, I'll be there. She nodded slowly, overwhelmed. Not yet, she whispered. But maybe soon. Keanu placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. There's no pressure, but in the meantime, let me make sure you're taken care of. I don't want luxury, she said. No television cameras, no red carpets. I know, he said. Just safety, dignity, a warm place to sleep. Doctors who listen, people who care. She looked at him, measuring the sincerity in his eyes. If you do that for others, not just for me, I'll accept your help. Keanu smiled. I already started. Lucia's gaze softened. You were always kind, even when you were small. It stayed with me. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a folded scrap of paper. She handed it to him. A poem I wrote a long time ago, for the boy I once knew. Keanu opened it slowly. The words were faded but still legible, where silence was louder than thunder. The boy listened, and I prayed he'd never forget, that he was seen. Later that evening, Keanu sat outside the clinic, the slip of Lucia's poem still folded in his palm. The sky was streaked with the last light of day, and downtown traffic buzzed somewhere in the distance. He looked up and watched as a few stars pushed through the fading blue. The poem echoed in his mind, not just words, but a legacy, a tether back to a childhood moment he didn't even know was unfinished. Inside, Lucia had finally agreed to a small apartment not far from the clinic. A social worker would help her manage medical appointments and provide a connection to programs she had long been excluded from. But her only condition stood firm. No media, no spotlight. What she needed was not attention, but restoration. Keanu honored her request. He didn't call his agent. He didn't draft a press release. Instead, he began visiting shelters and women's centers quietly, listening, learning. He sat with survivors, not as a celebrity, but as a man trying to understand the broken framework that allowed someone like Lucia to vanish in plain sight. He met with advocates and nonprofit organizers, asking hard questions. What barriers kept women like Lucia from being found? What legal loopholes allowed abusers to escape consequence? What did safety look like, truly look like, for women fleeing trauma without resources? And each night, he returned to his apartment and jotted notes, not just ideas, but commitments, steps. Lucia, meanwhile, kept her world small. She spent mornings walking the perimeter of the small park across from her new apartment. She talked occasionally with her caseworker and sometimes wrote in a new notebook Keanu had given her. Blank pages this time, soft linen cover, unmarked and full of space. Marisol wrote letters. She didn't push for a meeting yet, she just wrote, slowly and often. Keanu became their bridge, delivering them by hand. Lucia read them one by one, always in private. She smiled more afterward, and one day she said softly, "She writes just like me." In one of those letters, Marisol had written a single sentence that stayed with Lucia for days. "You were my silence, and now you are my sound." Those words mattered more than any apology could have. Eventually, Keanu stood on a small stage at a fundraiser, not for his own cause, but for an organization already helping displaced women find long-term stability. When he spoke, he said little of himself. He simply told the story of a woman who disappeared, not by choice, but by the world turning its back. That night, he announced a quiet endowment fund under an alias. It would go to helping women like Lucia, those who never wanted to be seen but deserved to be held. And as he left the event, slipping into the shadows rather than the spotlight, Keanu felt something shift. Not closure, but connection. Not fame, but the beginning of justice. And somewhere, in a small apartment tucked into a corner of the city, Lucia wrote 3 new words in her notebook: "I am here." Marisol had never told anyone the full story, not even her husband, not even her closest friends. To most, she was the no-nonsense trauma nurse, the one who could handle the worst of nights without flinching. But buried beneath her calm surface was a childhood marked by unanswered questions and quiet heartbreak. The foster homes changed often. So did the names of the women she called Mom for a few months at a time, but her real mother's name, Lucia, remained sacred, tucked deep in her heart like a song she wasn't allowed to sing. She remembered small things: the scent of cinnamon on her mother's apron, the way her fingers danced through her hair while humming lullabies in Spanish. And then, one day, it was all gone. No warning, no note, no explanation, just a social worker standing by the door with a garbage bag for her toys. For years, she was told Lucia had abandoned her, that some women just weren't made to be mothers. But she never believed it, not really. In her heart, she knew something else had happened, something unspoken. The world said her mother vanished. Marisol always believed her mother was taken, by fear, by shame, by something cruel. As she sat across from Keanu in the quiet garden of the center he'd helped fund, she finally shared what she'd held for decades. "I had to fight for everything," she said, voice steady but eyes wet. "School, safety, dignity. Nothing came easy, but I told myself, if I ever made it through, I'd help others do the same." Keanu listened in stillness, not interrupting once. The humility in his expression never wavered. Marisol leaned forward, her voice softening. "You remembering her, Keanu, it changed something. All this time, people talked about her like she was weak. You saw her as someone who mattered. That's more than I ever got from anyone." He nodded slowly. "Lucia mattered to me. She was a part of the good in my life. I didn't know what happened to her. I should have asked. I should have—" "You were a child," she interrupted gently. "And I was too. We both carried something we didn't choose." There was silence between them. But it wasn't the heavy kind. It was the kind that made room for truth, the kind that softened years of grief into something almost manageable. "I still remember her laugh," Marisol whispered. "It's the only thing that didn't fade." Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out the notebook, the one Lucia had left on the bench in Los Angeles. He passed it to her slowly, unsure if he was offering comfort or reopening a wound. She opened it, flipping through pages of sketches, song lyrics, prayers scrawled in hurried ink. She paused at one image, a small girl with a bandage on her knee and pigtails tilted to one side. "That's me," she said, voice cracking. Her hands trembled. The pages absorbed a few tears. "She never stopped loving you," Keanu said quietly. "Even when she was invisible to the world, she never let go." Marisol closed the notebook and held it to her chest. Then she nodded. Not to him, not to the garden around them, but to something inside her that had waited a long time to be seen. Marisol didn't say much after that. She just sat with the notebook in her lap, fingers tracing the edges of its worn cover like it was something holy. Every so often, she'd glance down and quietly whisper the lines of a poem her mother had written in the margins. Something about stars that didn't need names to shine. Later that week, Keanu arranged something private. No press, no cameras, just a single table in a quiet community center tucked into a neighborhood where no one would think to look. It was modest, almost too modest for the gravity of the moment, but that was the point. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about healing. Lucia arrived in a borrowed shawl and freshly combed hair. She looked fragile but alert, nervous but composed. She hadn't seen her daughter in over 3 decades, and the fear of what that might look like hovered around her like fog. Marisol entered the room slowly, holding the notebook close. Her breath caught when she saw her. Not because Lucia looked exactly the same, she didn't, but because her mother still had the same eyes, and when they met hers, they softened like sun on water. Lucia took a step forward but stopped. "I didn't think I'd ever get to see you again," she said, barely above a whisper. Marisol blinked hard, walked the final steps, and reached out. Not for a hug, not yet, but for her hand. "I never stopped waiting," she said. They stood there for a moment, holding each other's gaze, letting years of absence, confusion, and pain pass between them without being spoken. Sometimes the body carries what words can't. Sometimes the heart remembers without instruction. Keanu stayed outside, sitting on the curb near the garden beds. He didn't want to intrude on something sacred. The world might never know what happened inside that room. He hoped it wouldn't. Some stories aren't meant for headlines. An hour later, the door opened. Marisol stepped out first, wiping her eyes, followed by Lucia, who looked lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd worn like skin had finally fallen off. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Lucia looked toward Keanu and smiled. It was small, but it was real. Then she turned to her daughter and took her hand again. The two walked off together, slowly, their silhouettes shrinking as they made their way down the quiet sidewalk, the kind of path you can only take with someone who knows your pain. Keanu sat back, hands folded, watching the moment unfold like a final scene in a film that never needed a script. Later that evening, Marisol called him. "She's tired," she said, "but she wants to paint again." She asked for a little set of brushes and a sketch pad. Keanu smiled through the phone. "I'll send the best ones." And then, after a short pause, Marisol added, "Thank you for remembering her, for making me feel like I wasn't wrong all these years." "You weren't," Keanu said. "And now she knows that too." The next morning, Keanu stopped by a small art supply store near Silver Lake. He didn't want to send anything from a high-end gallery or a luxury brand. He wanted it to feel human, real, something a woman like Lucia could pick up without feeling like she had to prove she deserved it. He chose a wooden box of brushes, soft charcoal pencils, and a mixed media sketchbook with thick, textured pages. He also added a set of watercolors in muted earth tones. The colors reminded him of her, the way she used to hum while folding laundry, the way she paused to stare at sunsets out the window when he was just a boy. Quiet tones. He dropped the supplies off himself at Marisol's apartment, a modest but warm space with shelves lined in books about trauma, healing, and anatomy. Marisol opened the door in scrubs, ready to head out for another shift. She smiled when she saw him, genuine and calm. "She's in the sunroom," she said. "She doesn't go out much, but she sits there for hours." Keanu peeked inside and saw Lucia at a small table, the light casting soft shadows across her face. The notebook lay open beside a cup of tea, and she was already sketching. Her hands trembled a little, but her lines were firm, focused, intentional. Marisol stepped beside him. "She drew all night," she whispered. "Said it helps her remember herself, not just the pain, the good parts too." He didn't go in. Didn't want to disturb the moment. Instead, he nodded and handed the box to Marisol. "No logos, no brands," he said. "Just the tools. The rest, she already has." Marisol laughed gently and hugged him, a quiet, thankful embrace. "Do you know what this means to her?" she asked. "I don't," Keanu admitted. "But I think I understand what it means to you." Marisol pulled back and looked at him. "It's not just that you found her, it's that you saw her." Keanu left that day without fanfare, just as he had approached the woman on the bench weeks ago. No press releases, no donations made in his name, just people trying to find pieces of themselves in the places where life had once broken them. That evening, Marisol texted him a photo. It was a new drawing. Lucia had sketched a scene from decades ago. 2 children playing on a front porch, a boy with wide, thoughtful eyes, a girl with a scraped knee, and a woman in the doorway, humming. Beneath it, she had written in delicate script, "I never disappeared. I was just waiting to be seen again." The box was small but heavy with time. Wrapped in an old scarf that smelled faintly of lavender and rain, it sat on the table between them. Lucia's trembling hands resting lightly on the top, as if afraid it would vanish. Keanu sat across from her in the quiet room of the transitional care home, where a breeze from the cracked window stirred the curtains and sunlight filtered through with gentle persistence. "I never meant for these to be read by anyone," Lucia said softly, "but I think maybe it's time." She pushed the box toward him. Her fingers lingered on the edge for a moment, then slipped away. Keanu lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, their corners softened and yellowed. Some were addressed in careful handwriting to Marisol, others to Kim Reeves, and a few simply read Keanu. Most had no address, no stamps, just words written and sealed, then locked away. He picked one up, dated March 1983. "Dear Marisol, you were 7 the last time I saw you. I still see your hair tied with the red ribbon I gave you. I still remember your laugh when I told you stories about the sky. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I was afraid I wasn't strong enough to protect you." His throat tightened as he read on. The letter detailed Lucia's shame, her fear, her belief that the moment she was cast out, everything she loved would be taken from her. There was no bitterness in the letter, only sorrow and love that had nowhere to go but into ink and folded pages. Keanu looked up. Lucia had closed her eyes. Her breathing was calm, as though she were listening to memories only she could hear. He opened another letter, this one addressed to Kim. "Sweet Kimmy, you were just a little girl, but so brave. You always said thank you when I made you toast, and you once gave me a drawing of a flower and said, 'This is you.' When I disappeared, I prayed you'd remember the good things, that I made you feel safe. I was never allowed to say goodbye, but I whispered it anyway. Through the crack in your bedroom door that night." Keanu wiped at his eyes. His sister had carried questions her whole life, and here, on fragile paper, were answers neither of them had dared hope for. He reached the bottom of the box. A single envelope remained. It was addressed to him. He turned the envelope over in his hands. It was unsealed, as if even after writing it, Lucia hadn't been sure she could bear to let it go. Inside was a single page, creased neatly, the ink slightly smudged at the corners, like it had been held too long, too often. "Keanu, you were the quietest boy I ever knew. Always watching, always listening. You didn't speak unless it mattered, and even then, you chose your words like they were gifts. That's how I knew you saw more than anyone thought. When I left, I wondered if you'd remember me. I hoped you wouldn't. Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't want your memory to be filled with confusion or pain. But I saw you on a movie screen once. You were older, but your eyes hadn't changed. I thought, he made it. He's okay. And I cried. I never stopped loving any of you. I just didn't know how to return. Lucia. Keanu read the letter twice, then folded it back along its original creases and returned it to the envelope. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. His hands rested on the box, as if anchoring him to the moment. Later that evening, he brought the box to his sister. Kia met him in the garden of her home, her expression already tense with unspoken emotion. Keanu sat beside her on the wooden bench under the jacaranda tree and held out the box without a word. She opened it slowly, lifting one letter after another. Her fingers shook as she read the first line of the one addressed to her. "Oh my God," she whispered. She remembered. "My drawing." She didn't finish the letter before tears blurred her vision. Her shoulders curled inward, as if folding into herself. Keanu placed a gentle hand on her back, letting the silence speak. "I always wondered what happened to her," she said finally. "I thought maybe I made her up, or maybe I did something wrong." Keanu shook his head. "We were just kids," he said quietly. "None of it was our fault." Kim nodded, brushing at her cheeks. Then she looked at him, her eyes steadier now. "She's still alive?" "She, miss. Frail but present, still drawing, still remembering." Kim held the box close to her chest, cradling it like a part of her own history had come home. "We have to do something, Ki," she whispered, "before it's too late." The next morning, Keanu and Kim sat across from each other in a small cafe tucked into a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood. They hadn't done this in years, just the two of them, without an event or press obligation pulling at their time. Between them, the box of Lucia's letters sat on the table like a sacred relic of something nearly lost. They spoke softly about what to do. "She gave us these for a reason," Kim said, her voice firm but tender. "Not just so we'd know, but so we'd carry it forward." Keanu nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's not enough to reconnect. We have to honor her." They brainstormed quietly, carefully. No grand media gesture, no press release. That wasn't what Lucia would want. But something real, something that could live beyond just them. Later that week, they visited the women's clinic, where Keanu had first reconnected with Lucia. She sat in the garden, bundled in a shawl, her sketchbook open in her lap. When she saw them together, she smiled, but didn't get up. Kim knelt beside her, tears already forming in her eyes. "I missed you," Kim whispered, her voice breaking. Lucia touched her cheek. "I missed you too, Menina." They sat together for a long time, no words needed. The afternoon sun stretched across the garden as time softened its grip on everything that had once been lost. Keanu sat beside them, watching gently. His heart, so often weighed by fame, expectation, and loss, felt something it hadn't in a long time: peace. By the end of the week, he and Kim made a quiet donation in Lucia's name to fund transitional housing for retired caregivers. They didn't put their names on the plaque. It simply read, "For Lucia." And the letters never sent. Keanu stood on the same stretch of concrete where the city hummed in layers, distant horns, quiet chatter, footsteps, wind rustling the sycamore trees above. The bench was still there, faded, chipped, and still waiting, as if it held stories in its splinters. In his hands, a paper bag warmed his palms. The scent of roasted vegetables, bread, and a little cup of lentil soup drifted into the air. It wasn't much, but it was honest. And it was what he wished he could have offered sooner. He didn't expect to see her again. Lucia hadn't returned to this bench. After their quiet reunion, and the fragile, aching bridge she'd begun rebuilding with her daughter. Keanu knew she needed privacy more than anything. Some stories shouldn't be watched. They should be protected. So today he brought the meal without an expectation. Maybe it was a silent thank you. Maybe it was a prayer disguised as a routine. He just wanted to honor where it all began. As he approached, his steps slowed. A figure sat where Lucia once had. A woman, early 50s, with soft lines etched in her face like a road map of a life lived wide. She wasn't begging, wasn't speaking, just drawing. A small spiral-bound sketchbook rested on her lap. A pencil danced across the page with a light hand. Keanu hesitated. Then he moved closer, crouched near the edge of the bench, and gently offered the paper bag. "I brought lunch," he said quietly. She looked up, eyes alert, surprised but not frightened. She blinked twice, then smiled, gently. "That's kind of you." He sat on the far end of the bench as she took the bag in both hands. "Thank you," she said again, as though she hadn't heard kindness in a long time. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The city moved past them. But there on that bench, time felt slowed. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid on the soup. She glanced sideways at him. "You look familiar." He smiled, not replying. Sometimes it was easier not to name the thing people were trying to place. It didn't matter here. "What are you drawing?" She turned the sketchbook slightly toward him. It was a half-finished image of the city skyline at dusk, nothing grand. But the strokes were delicate, the shadows honest. "I just like light," she said. "How it lands on buildings, or shoulders, or things people forget." He nodded. That sentence could have come straight from Lucia. She sipped the soup slowly, savoring each bite like it carried something sacred. Keanu watched without pressing further. It wasn't about pity. It wasn't about rescue. It was about being present, about noticing someone who would otherwise be passed by. The woman eventually closed her notebook and set it in her lap. "Why'd you bring lunch to a stranger?" Keanu leaned back, resting his hand on the bench's edge. "Because someone once told me, kindness can find its way back to you, even years later." She looked at him more closely now. There was something in her gaze, part wonder, part understanding, as if she recognized he was speaking from experience, not principle. "You knew someone who sat here?" she said softly, more a statement than a question. He nodded. "I did. I thought I was just helping someone down on their luck, but I didn't realize she helped raise me. Before life pushed her into the shadows." The woman swallowed hard, blinking back whatever that stirred in her. "Sometimes the world forgets people like her." "She never forgot anyone," Keanu replied. "She just didn't know how to come back." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light shift on the pavement. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, folded square of paper. "Would you like to see one of hers?" Confused, he accepted the folded sketch. It was an old drawing, rough, faded, charcoal on thin paper, a young boy on a porch, sitting next to a woman holding a book. The boy's face was turned up to her, lit with laughter. She gave this to the clinic years ago, said it was one of her only memories that still felt warm. Keanu stared. The boy was him, the woman was Lucia. He traced the outline with his eyes, every detail triggering something inside him he couldn't name. "He drew from memory?" he asked. Tube said, "Love remembers things the mind forgets." He folded the sketch carefully and held it in both hands. "I'll never forget her again." The woman finished the soup, then carefully placed the empty container back in the bag. Keanu stood and offered his hand. She hesitated, then accepted it with grace. A quiet bond formed, not from history, but from understanding. As she walked away, he turned back to the bench. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the space. For a moment, he imagined Lucia still sitting there, head down, sketching, waiting for someone to truly see her. He sat for a few more minutes, and then, with a quiet breath, he whispered, "Thank you." Because one small act, a simple meal, had opened the door to a hidden chapter of his past, healed old wounds, reunited a family, and reminded him that behind every quiet face, there is a story waiting to be honored. Sometimes the universe sends the past back in ragged clothes, hoping to be seen. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is stopping long enough to offer lunch. And to listen. The mural was nearly finished. A wave of oranges, purples, and deep teal curved across the stucco wall of a modest building tucked near the corner of Pico and Union. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it told a story, quiet and powerful, the kind you had to lean in to understand. Lucia stood back, squinting up at the last panel. In her hand was a brush, worn thin. Her grip trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from reverence. She had painted dozens of faces on that wall. Children, laughing, reading, holding hands. Some from memory, some imagined. And one, the very last, was a boy with dark hair and curious eyes, sitting on the ground with a toy train in his lap. Lucia smiled softly as she added the last stroke to his chin. Keanu. She didn't say his name out loud. She didn't need to. Behind her, the courtyard of Casa Marisol buzzed with quiet movement. Folding chairs scraped. Laughter floated from a small group of women in gardening gloves, tending raised flower beds. A nurse led a group therapy session beneath the shade of a pepper tree. And inside, Marisol's voice echoed down the hallway, warm and composed, welcoming a new resident with calm authority. It had taken months of paperwork, permits, and late-night planning sessions, but it was real now. The nonprofit for at-risk domestic workers wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a shelter, a home, a beginning. Keanu had helped with the early funding, quietly. He refused naming rights, refused to speak at the launch. "This is her story," he'd said. "I just opened a few doors." It was Marisol who insisted on naming the place after her mother, not because of what happened to Lucia, but because of what she did with her pain. "Heem took the worst thing that ever happened to her," Marisol once said, "and used it to create safety for someone else." Lucia lived on site now, in a private room just off the garden. She received care, art supplies, and, above all, peace. No one asked for photos. No one treated her like a ghost come back to life. Here, she was simply Lucia, the woman who painted with memory, who smiled at every child who passed. One afternoon, Keanu returned to visit. No cameras, no driver. Just him, in jeans and a soft t-shirt, holding 2 coffees and a small paper bag of pan dulce. Lucia saw him through the window and waved him in. They sat on the mural bench beneath her painting, sipping in companionable silence. She nodded toward the boy on the wall. "You always liked trains." Keanu chuckled, surprised. "I haven't thought about that in years." "You had a red one. You'd let your sister drive it if she asked nicely, but only then." He laughed again, the sound echoing warmly in the courtyard. Lucia turned toward him. "Do you know why I painted this?" He shook his head. "Because this is the moment I remember most clearly. You weren't an actor yet. You weren't famous. You were just a kind little boy who always offered me the seat closest to the heater in winter." Keanu looked down, overwhelmed for a moment. "You remembered everything." "I had to," she said gently, "because, for a long time, no one else did." Later that week, Marisol gathered a small group in the main room. The morning sun filtered through high windows, casting soft gold across the wood floor. A whiteboard leaned against the wall with today's topic, memory and worth. Lucia sat near the back, her sketchbook open on her lap, but her pencil still. Marisol addressed the group, most of them women over 50. Former housekeepers, caregivers, survivors. Some still healing from years spent in silence. all of them now part of a story that didn't end in abandonment. "We've talked about wages and rights," Marisol said, "but today is about something else. About what happens when you're finally seen." Lucia didn't speak, but her presence said everything. Afterward, Keanu helped distribute fresh journals, part of a writing program they'd launched with donated supplies. Each woman received a pen with her name engraved. It was a small gesture, but for many, it was the first time their names had ever been printed on something that belonged only to them. Lucia smiled as a woman named Darlene clutched her pen to her chest like a gift from royalty. That night, Keanu lingered in the courtyard as twilight settled. He watched the shadows move across the mural wall. The boy with the train. The girl reading a book. A third panel now in progress. Lucia seated in a garden, head bowed slightly, a paper in her lap. Marisol had started sketching it quietly, using old photographs in memory, a tribute to her mother's quiet strength. Keanu looked down at the small stone plaque embedded near the mural's edge. It read, "Casa Marisol. For the women who raised us, then vanished." He closed his eyes. He remembered the sound of Lucia's humming in the hallway. He remembered the warmth of her hands when he had the flu. He remembered the silence that followed her disappearance, and the hole it left in a boy too young to understand. But most of all, he remembered the moment she looked at him again after all those years and said, "You turned out kind." That had been enough. The next morning, he sat with Marisol over coffee. They were reviewing plans to expand the shelter's outreach, a mobile legal clinic, a scholarship fund for the daughters of domestic workers, an annual memorial for the ones lost to violence or poverty. Marisol turned a page in her binder. "You know, when this started, I thought I was doing it for her." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "But I think," she said slowly, "I was doing it for the girl I used to be, the one who waited every day at that window for a mother who never came home." He nodded. "And now?" She looked toward the courtyard, where Lucia sat under the pepper tree, drawing again. "Now, I'm doing it for every girl still waiting." That afternoon, Keanu prepared to leave. Lucia walked with him to the gate, her steps slow but steady. "Thank you," she said. He turned to her, puzzled. "For what?" "For believing I deserved more than a memory." He gently placed a hand over hers. "You gave me more than you'll ever know." As the gate clicked behind him, Lucia returned to her mural. She dipped her brush, looked up at the boy on the wall, and whispered, "Keep going." And so the wall grew, one stroke at a time, one face after another, not as a monument, but as a promise. No one else would be forgotten. The mural had been up for 2 months before anyone outside the community noticed it. It started with a teenager from a nearby high school. Her name was Naomi Tran. She volunteered at Casa Marisol on weekends, helping with translation and art supplies. One Sunday morning, she snapped a picture of the mural just after sunrise. The colors were glowing, soft and radiant, and the boy painted in the lower corner looked strikingly familiar. Naomi didn't think much of it. She posted the photo on her personal Instagram with a simple caption, "A movie star and his nanny, painted on a wall in Pico Union. Her name was Lucia. This is their story." She tagged no one, she used no hashtags, but within hours the post was shared by a classmate, then a teacher, then a local reporter with a modest following. By nightfall, the image had traveled across the internet, reaching eyes far beyond Los Angeles. People were curious. The mural showed a woman surrounded by children, painted in soft brushstrokes, her face serene. Beside her was a small boy, unmistakably modeled after a young Keanu Reeves. Speculation exploded. Forums lit up. Headlines popped overnight. Did Keanu Reeves just fund a shelter for his childhood nanny? Hollywood icon quietly supports former caregiver. Who is Lucia Calderon? Photographers rushed to the mural the next day, only to find no one willing to speak. The volunteers at Casa Marisol remained firm. The women in the shelter said nothing. A small paper sign was taped to the mural gate. Respect the silence that built this place. Reporters still came, but the tone shifted. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a secret someone tried to bury. It was a quiet story that had unfolded without the world's attention, and that's what made it powerful. On the third day of the media frenzy, Keanu's publicist released a short statement. This is not a story about fame or charity. This is a story about memory, forgiveness, and dignity. Keanu Reeves respectfully asks for privacy for all individuals involved. He is deeply honored to have reconnected with someone who shaped his life during childhood. The work being done at Casa Marisol is ongoing and personal. That same morning, Marisol released a statement of her own, addressed not to the press but posted quietly on Casa Marisol's website. It read, Lucia Calderon was not a symbol. She was not a cause. She was a mother. A woman who once held the hand of a child when the world didn't see her. She survived what should have broken her, and when she finally spoke, she didn't ask for revenge. She asked for healing. That's the legacy we're building here. Not around her name, but around her spirit. That is enough. Neither of them agreed to interviews. Keanu turned down every request. Daytime shows, podcasts, magazine exclusives. He told his team to let the silence hold. Let the story breathe on its own. Marisol was firm. She declined every camera crew that reached out. You can't bottle a life in sound bites, she said. You can't simplify what took years to bury and months to unearth. But the world had already latched on. Not in anger, not in outrage, but in awe. Across the internet, strangers began posting their own stories. Former nannies, housekeepers, children raised by women who disappeared from their lives without explanation. Thousands of messages flooded Casa Marisol's inbox within days. Some offered donations. Others simply wrote, "Thank you for not letting her be forgotten." One message stood out. It came from a woman in rural Texas who had cared for a boy named Lucas in the early 1990s. She hadn't heard from the family in decades. "I thought I was just part of the wallpaper," she wrote. "Now I wonder if he remembers my name." Lucia read that email out loud during one of the center's evening story circles. Her voice cracked by the final sentence. She didn't say anything afterward, just looked around the room, eyes brimming, and nodded. They were being remembered, all of them. The shelter staff created a small exhibit inside one of the unused rooms. They called it the Invisible Thread. It featured sketches, letters, and testimonials from women who had once worked behind the scenes of families, often without thanks. Lucia's notebook rested in a sealed case. Not as a relic, but as a starting point. Keanu stopped by one evening, quietly. He stood before the notebook for a long time, reading a few of her lines. "Sometimes I dreamed the boy would grow up and remember the songs I hummed while folding laundry. That he'd hear them in his sleep and feel safe again." He didn't take a picture. He didn't post about it. He just stood there, one hand resting gently against the glass, and whispered, "I do remember." Meanwhile, Naomi, the high school volunteer whose post had started it all, was overwhelmed by the attention. Journalists kept calling. Influencers offered interviews. A talent agent even reached out. But she declined every request. She returned to the mural the following week and left a single sticky note at its base. It said, "Some stories deserve to stay sacred. I only meant to say thank you." Marisol found it the next day. She smiled, then slipped it into Lucia's sketchbook. Still, the attention brought change. Donations to Casa Marisol tripled in 1 week. An anonymous sponsor funded a second shelter in Oakland. A small foundation dedicated to honoring domestic workers was launched under Marisol's name, though she insisted Lucia's image never be used in promotions. "No logos, no slogans," she said. "Let the work speak." Hollywood asked questions too. One studio exec reached out with interest in developing a feature film. Keanu declined, with no hesitation. "Not everything needs to be turned into something," he told his team. The studio pressed. "You could inspire millions." He replied, "You don't need to recreate a miracle that already happened." Lucia never knew about the offers. Marisol never told her. That wasn't her world. Her world was now colored by late afternoons in the courtyard, music from the upstairs radio, and the laughter of women who had found safety and silence in equal measure. One morning, months after the mural went viral, a handwritten envelope arrived at Casa Marisol. The return address was from Toronto. Inside was a short letter, written in careful script. "I believe Lucia took care of me when I was very young. I remember her singing Cielito Lindo while brushing my hair. My mother never sang. If this is the same woman, please tell her I never forgot her voice. I've been looking for it ever since." Lucia held the letter in her lap for a long time. Her hand trembled slightly as she whispered, "It was her. I remember the girl. Her hair always had tangles." That afternoon, Marisol helped her write a short reply, just a few lines, no press, no reunion planned, just a quiet confirmation that someone remembered, and that it was enough. Meanwhile, the mural continued to draw visitors. Not crowds, not tour buses, just people. A woman in her 60s who touched the painted edge of Lucia's face and whispered a name. A teenage boy who stood quietly for a while, then left a folded drawing at the foot of the wall. His own nanny, smiling and strong. A retired teacher who brought a small bouquet and said, "I had a Lucia once too." Keanu came by less frequently now, not out of distance but respect. He knew the story no longer belonged to just him. It belonged to every person who had ever felt seen by someone society overlooked. Every child who had been loved by someone they couldn't name years later. One evening, as the light turned golden over the mural wall, he stood for a while without speaking. Marisol joined him, hands tucked into her jacket. "She wasn't invisible," he said finally. Marisol nodded. "She never was. We just didn't look closely enough." They stood side by side in the stillness. Then, as the sun dipped low, Keanu whispered, "She was enough." And for the first time, the world seemed to understand exactly what that meant. The plane touched down in Toronto just after noon. Keanu looked over at Lucia as the wheels bumped gently against the runway. Her eyes were closed, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. She looked peaceful, not excited, not anxious, just still. Like someone stepping back into a long-forgotten page of a book they never expected to read again. It had taken some convincing. Luciana wasn't sure she wanted to return, but when Keanu mentioned the old house might still be there, something in her shifted. Not urgency, not nostalgia, something quieter. Permission. They didn't announce the trip. Marisol arranged for a private driver and a quiet Airbnb nearby. Keanu handled the flight, chose a weekday when the neighborhood would be calm. No press, no attention, just one quiet return. As they pulled up to the address on St. Clair Avenue, Lucia leaned forward, squinting through the window. It was still there. The house had changed, new paint, new windows, a newer fence. But the bones were the same gentle slope of the roof, the same narrow path leading to the porch, the same maple tree leaning over the gate, taller now, but familiar. Lucia stepped out of the car slowly, leaning on a cane. Keanu stayed close, but didn't guide her. He knew this wasn't a moment to lead, it was one to follow. The current owners, a young couple with 2 kids, had agreed to let them visit. They had only moved in a year ago. When Marisol explained the story, not the fame, but the connection, they'd said yes without hesitation. Lucia paused at the base of the stairs. Then she climbed them, one careful step at a time. Her fingers brushed the railing like it was sacred. As they reached the door, the owner, a woman in her 30s, opened it with a warm smile. "Welcome," she said simply. Lucia nodded, too emotional to speak. She stepped inside. The hallway was narrower than she remembered. Or maybe she had just gotten smaller. But the light was the same, that soft spill through the front window, catching the edge of the staircase. She looked down, her breath hitching. "I used to mop this floor every morning," she whispered. Keanu stayed behind her, silent. She turned toward the living room. It had been remodeled, modern furniture, a sleek fireplace, but the layout was the same. She walked slowly across the space, her eyes sweeping the corners. "This was where I used to," she said, "while your mother made phone calls." She touched the edge of the wall, then looked back at Keanu. "Your sister used to dance right here, in her pajamas. Do you remember?" He nodded, throat tight. They moved toward the back of the house. The kitchen had been renovated, brighter now, but the tile on the far wall hadn't changed. Lucia walked over and placed her hand on one of the small blue squares near the counter's edge. "I chipped this one," she said with a smile. "Trying to reach a jar your mother kept too high?" Keanu chuckled quietly. "She never noticed," Lucia added. "Or maybe she did and didn't care. Some things didn't matter back then, only what people saw." They walked through a narrow hallway toward the rear staircase. Keanu offered his arm as they ascended, and this time, she accepted it. At the top of the stairs was a short hallway with 3 doors. Lucia stopped in front of the last one on the right. She reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then slowly turned it. The room had been converted into a guest room with soft gray walls and a modern bed, but the window was in the same place. The light fell in the same angled stripe across the floor. Lucia stepped inside, her feet barely making a sound on the hardwood. "This was my room," she said. Keanu stood in the doorway, letting her have the space. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain back. Outside, the backyard looked different, more landscaped. A new swing set, but the tall wooden fence remained. "I used to stand here at night and look out. I'd listen for your cry, just in case." She turned toward the closet. "Your mother let me bring one suitcase. I kept it right here, with pictures of Marisol inside. I'd open it late at night, after you were all asleep, just to look at her face." She walked to the wall beside the bed and placed her hand flat against it. "I used to press my ear here. This is where the nursery was, when you were small. I could hear you breathe through the wall." Keanu didn't move. His eyes were damp. She looked at him then, and her voice dropped. "I never stopped listening." He walked into the room finally, crossing the floor to stand beside her. For a long time they said nothing. Then she whispered, "You were always a kind child. Quiet, but kind. The world didn't take that from you." He reached for her hand. "It didn't," he said. "Because of you." They sat together on the old front porch before leaving. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting soft light across the porch steps. Lucia eased herself into a rocking chair that had been moved from inside. It wasn't the same one she used to sit in, but the motion was familiar. Keanu sat beside her on the wooden bench, both of them facing the quiet street. For a while they said nothing. A gentle breeze rustled the trees above. Somewhere nearby a dog barked, followed by a child's laughter. The neighborhood hadn't changed as much as he thought. Not where it counted. Lucia placed her hand over his. Her fingers were thin and warm. "You turned out kind," she said softly. Keanu turned to her, eyes glistening. "That's all I ever hoped," she added, voice trembling. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "You gave me that." She looked out toward the street. I used to watch you from this porch. When you were little, chasing your toy cars down the walkway, sometimes I'd worry you'd trip. But then you'd get back up, brush your knees off, and keep going." He smiled gently. "That sounds about right. You were always so serious when you played, like the world depended on it." He laughed, under his breath. "Maybe it did." Lucia reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of cloth. She handed it to him. It was a handkerchief, embroidered faintly with the letter K in the corner. "I made this for you once," she said, "but never gave it. Your mother probably would have asked why." He held it like something sacred. "I'm glad you kept it." "I kept everything," she said. "Even the memories that hurt?" He took a deep breath, watching a leaf tumble down from the old maple. "Me too." They sat there until the light turned golden and the shadows stretched long across the yard. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't for the world. It was just a quiet visit, years overdue. But in that stillness, something healed. Not everything, but enough. Lucia passed away on a quiet morning in early spring. It was just after dawn when the nurse made her rounds and found her room still, the soft rustle of the courtyard trees drifting in through a slightly open window. Lucia lay in bed, her hands folded over a closed sketchbook resting on her chest. A pencil was still tucked between her fingers, as though she had drifted to sleep mid-thought. There was no sign of pain, no panic, only peace. The night before, she'd attended the center's weekly art circle. She'd been quiet, more reflective than usual. She had drawn a child's silhouette beneath a tree, then handed the sketch to one of the newer residents with a soft smile and said, "You'll understand this someday." Then she kissed Marisol on the cheek and went to bed early. Marisol arrived first that morning. The message had been brief, just a soft-voiced call from the nurse. "She's gone," the nurse said gently. "Peace." Marisol entered the room alone. The curtains were drawn, just enough to let light streak across the bedspread in soft gold lines. She sat down beside her mother and placed her hand on hers. Lucia's skin was still warm. She didn't cry at first, just stared. Her mother looked the same as she always had when she was thinking. Eyebrows slightly drawn, jaw relaxed, like she was listening to something distant. Marisol whispered a prayer under her breath, one they used to say in Spanish when she was a child. Then she kissed her mother's forehead. Keanu arrived 2 hours later. He came quietly, parking behind the center and walking through the back entrance to avoid attention. He didn't speak when he entered Lucia's room. He simply stood beside the bed, removed his cap, and looked at her. Then he sat in the chair across from Marisol. Neither said a word for several minutes. Eventually, Keanu spoke. "She looks like she's dreaming." Marisol nodded. "I hope it's of the garden." He reached for Lucia's sketchbook. He didn't open it, just rested it on his lap and stared at the cover. The frayed corners, the small sun drawn near the top edge, the initials L. pressed faintly in ink. He ran his fingers across the worn paper like it was a treasured relic. Later that afternoon, they began planning. There would be no press, no announcement, no tribute in magazines. Lucia would not have wanted that. Instead, they would hold a private ceremony just for those who truly knew her. Not by name or reputation, but by spirit. The memorial was held on a Sunday morning beneath the flowering pepper trees in the shelter's courtyard. No one wore black. Lucia had once said she didn't want to be mourned in shadows. She wanted music, light, and something blooming nearby. So they honored that. Chairs were arranged in a loose circle facing the mural. A low table was placed in the center, holding a single white candle, her favorite mug, and a bundle of fresh lavender. Marisol greeted each guest with a quiet embrace. Naomi brought small watercolor bookmarks, one for each woman, each painted with Lucia's signature, looped in her delicate, thoughtful hand. The women from the shelter sat close together. Many of them held tissues or small keepsakes. A few brought drawings they had made with Lucia over the past year. One woman clutched a framed poem that Lucia had helped her finish. Another carried a copy of a letter she'd written to her estranged son, inspired by Lucia's story of reunion. Keanu stayed off to the side as the ceremony began. He wasn't there to lead, only to listen. Marisol stepped forward and looked out over the courtyard. "We gather today not to say goodbye," she said softly, "but to carry forward what Lucia gave to each of us." She paused, holding her mother's sketchbook in both hands. "She taught us that silence isn't emptiness, it's protection. And when someone breaks that silence, they deserve to be heard." No one applauded. No one moved. They just let the words settle, like seeds planted deep. At the conclusion of the service, Marisol led the group toward the new wing of the shelter. The hallway was freshly painted, the floors shining. At the far end hung the portrait. It was framed in reclaimed wood, soft and aged. In the drawing, Lucia sat under a pepper tree, sketchbook in her lap, head tilted upward toward the sky. Her expression was open, peaceful, alive. Below it, in hand-carved lettering, read the words, "Lady never stopped caring." Several women stopped to place their hands gently on the frame. Others knelt and whispered blessings. A few wept quietly. Outside, the garden had been renamed. A wooden sign now read, "Calderon Grove." Keanu stood beside a newly dug hole near the edge of the grove, holding a young sapling, a red maple, the same kind that stood outside the old Toronto home. Its roots were bundled in burlap. Its leaves were already turning soft shades of green. He knelt, lowered the sapling into the soil, and gently packed the earth around it. As he stood, he placed both hands on the trunk and whispered, "You're home now." Then he stepped back. Marisol joined him, pressing a small tag into the dirt near the base. It read simply, "Planted for Lucia, with love." The wind picked up gently, rustling the branches. Sunlight streamed through the leaves, dappling the ground where women stood in a loose circle, heads bowed not in grief, but in reverence. In the weeks that followed, the tree began to bloom. The women watered it daily, tying ribbons around the branches as they healed. They sat on benches nearby, telling stories of the women who raised them, the ones who loved them when no one else did. Lucia's portrait watched over them from the shelter wall, quiet, steady, and unblinking. A presence that didn't fade, because the world had finally listened, and she had never stopped caring. The letter sat unopened for days. Keanu had written it late one night after the memorial, sitting alone on the back steps of his home, with only the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog in the background. It came to him slowly, one sentence at a time. At first, he wasn't sure who he was writing to, but as the words formed, he realized it was the boy, the one who had once lived in that Toronto house, the one who sat cross-legged in the hallway while Lucia folded laundry just a few feet away, the one who never thought to ask where she had gone when she disappeared. He titled it simply, "To the Boy Who Didn't Know How to Ask." When the private donor event for Casa Marisol was announced, a quiet gathering at a modest garden in Pasadena, Keanu almost declined the invitation to speak. But Marisol had looked at him and said, "This part of the work needs your voice." So he said yes. On the evening of the event, guests arrived in muted clothing, dressed not for spectacle but sincerity. A simple canopy had been set up beside a winding garden path. Folding chairs faced a small podium, nestled beneath blooming wisteria. The attendees included nonprofit leaders, shelter directors, private donors, and a handful of women from Casa Marisol. There was no red carpet, no step and repeat, just a gentle breeze and the smell of jasmine in the air. Marisol introduced him briefly. "He's here not as an actor but as someone who believes that the unseen deserve to be seen," she said. Keanu stepped forward slowly, He didn't bring notes, just the folded letter in his jacket pocket. He stood quietly for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then he unfolded the page and began to read. "Dear Kay," he began, "you are 7 years old. You don't know yet how to name the feeling in your chest when someone leaves without saying goodbye. You think the world is safe because the laundry is always folded and someone hums while they mop the kitchen. You think love is permanent because it arrives quietly and never asks for anything." He paused and glanced up. "You will grow up and forget details, what song she was humming, what story she was telling your sister. You'll forget her middle name, but you will remember the warmth of her hand when you were sick, and the way she always put the spoon in the oatmeal before you sat down." He continued reading, voice steady, though his hands gripped the page a little tighter. "You will grow up believing you were kind, and maybe you were, but you won't ask about her, not once. You will accept silence like it's the air you breathe. You'll assume someone else had a reason, that adults made choices too big for you to understand, and so you won't look for her. You won't wonder if she was safe. You'll let her vanish." He paused again, and the quiet that followed was full and unbroken. "You will become a man who tells stories. You'll be praised for being humble, for noticing people, for caring. But there will be a space inside you, shaped like someone who mattered. And you won't understand what's missing until a woman on a bench says your name like she's been carrying it in her chest for decades." A breeze passed through the garden. A few guests wiped their eyes, others leaned forward, holding their breath. Vision will look different, older, tired. But when she hands you a drawing of you as a child laughing beside her, you will remember everything. And in that moment, you'll want to apologize to your younger self for not knowing how to ask, for not wondering, for not noticing the people who fed you, comforted you, taught you kindness in invisible ways. Keanu's voice caught slightly, but he didn't stop. "You will find out that she was hurt, that people failed her, that your own house was not the safe place you thought it was for everyone who entered. You will see the ways your silence became part of her disappearance, and it will haunt you." He folded the page slightly, then finished. "But you will also do something else. You will listen. You will show up. You will try. Not to fix the past, but to honor it, to hold her story in your hands the way she once held your fevered body. You will plant a tree in her name. You will build a space where others like her are no longer invisible." He looked around the garden, at the faces watching him, not as fans, but as fellow witnesses. "And if I could say one thing to you, younger me, it would be this. Be someone who notices, who asks, who doesn't look away." He folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket. The garden remained still. No applause, no music, just the quiet weight of truth. Marisol walked to his side and gently placed her hand over his. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Later that evening, as guests left the garden and donations were quietly pledged to fund legal clinics, scholarships, and support services for domestic workers, Keanu remained behind. He sat on a low stone bench near the path, the letter still in his coat pocket, and he thought of the boy he once was, the boy who sat in hallways, the boy who didn't ask. Now, finally, he had. The waves moved in slow rhythm, their hush folding over the sand like breath. Keanu walked along the edge of the beach near Santa Monica just before sunset. The sky was painted in soft amber and lavender, the kind of light that made even the busiest cities feel sacred. He came here sometimes, after visiting the archive. Lucia's mural had been recreated on a canvas that now hung inside the nonprofit's new Los Angeles headquarters. They had carefully photographed and scaled the original piece after sun and wind had begun to weather it. The new version was hung in a quiet room reserved for reflection. On the wall beside it, her sketchbook was displayed behind glass, turned to a page showing two children beneath a tree, their hands linked. The room didn't require silence, but most people instinctively lowered their voices when they entered. It wasn't a memorial. It was a place for remembering, a place that asked nothing but attention. Keanu stepped off the sidewalk and stood near the pier railing, watching the horizon. Down below, just out of the wind's reach, a young woman in a hoodie was crouched beside an unhoused man seated on the sand. She was handing him a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a folded jacket. She smiled, said something that made him laugh, then patted his shoulder before heading back toward the sidewalk. It was a small moment, the kind of thing that happened hundreds of times in a city like this. But Keanu noticed it. That was the thing about grief when it turned into purpose. It sharpened your eyes. You began to see the small hinges on which big changes turned. He took a deep breath and sat on a nearby bench, letting the wind tug at the edges of his coat. His mind drifted to Lucia's final weeks, how she had spent them, not in regret or bitterness, but in giving, drawing, listening, laughing. She had vanished once, lost to the silence of systems that didn't care to hold her story. But now, through Marisol, through Casa Marisol, and through the hundreds of women who passed through its doors, she was remembered in ways that mattered. Lucia had told him once, "The past doesn't always want to be fixed, but it wants to be heard." That sentence had stayed with him. He thought about the letter he had written, the tree he had planted, the mural that still stood in the garden courtyard, faded by the sun but intact. These were not acts of closure, they were acts of continuation. Quiet, persistent reminders that love didn't vanish when people disappeared. It remained in what was passed down, in what was noticed, in what was changed. A few children rode bikes across the boardwalk behind him, their laughter rising above the soft crash of waves. The world kept moving. It always did. But now, he moved with a different rhythm, one shaped not by urgency, but by attention. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and flipped it open. Inside were sketches, quotes, and notes he had scribbled over the past few months. Lucia's voice lived between those pages. So did Marisol's strength, Naomi's humility, and the resilience of every woman whose life had intersected with theirs. He wrote a line at the bottom of the last page, "Quiet acts, multiplied, change everything." Closing the notebook, he stood and took one last look at the horizon. The wind had picked up and the tide was shifting. Change always came in waves, sometimes loud and crashing, other times soft as breath. But it came. He walked away from the beach slowly, back toward the city where the next moment was already waiting. And as he passed the young volunteer again, he smiled, not just in gratitude, but in recognition. The world didn't need louder heroes. It needed more people who paid attention. Lucia had taught him that. And now, it was time to keep listening. Have you ever discovered a forgotten part of your past that changed your understanding of someone you love? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And what kind of story should Keanu star in next? A hidden letter? A lost sibling? A memory waiting to be found? Let us know what you'd like to see. Because sometimes the stories we uncover say more about who we are than the ones we choose to forget.